It's totally cool if you tune me out for the next 5 to 8 minutes while you are filling out that blue card that's missionaries. They're going all over the world with the good news of the gospel. Some in places that they had to have a slight, we couldn't quite see who they were, and their identities are more hidden because they are going into some hostile places with the gospel. But here's what I want you to know about that, why that's important, and I'm sharing that with you, is that our church played a role in that. If you're new to the Baptist world, which I grew up Methodist, I was new to the Baptist world, I had to figure it out. That's a whole story for a whole nother day. But if you're new to the Baptist world, one of the incredibly wonderful things about our denomination is that we pool together our resources for the sake of missions. So we played a role in sending those church planners and those missionaries. We send that 10% that we shared with you at the beginning. Every time that you give, a portion of that goes into a pot that goes into a bigger pot with Southern Baptist churches all over the country, all over the world. And we share those resources so that we can effectively train and send missionaries. And it was so cool to be part of that. So here's the deal. As we get into Missions Month, my prayer for you is really two things. First is that over this month that you would recognize that a missionary is not someone that is other than you. A missionary is someone that sees the places that they go as a place that is ready to receive the gospel of Jesus, and they say yes to going to those places. And my prayer during this month is that your eyes would be open to the fact that you are a missionary in the places where God already has you. Your spheres of influence, where you go to work, where you have relationship and friendship, where you go play whatever it is that you play, your work and your play and your spheres of influence, those are places where the gospel needs to be shared. And so you are a missionary. The second thing I'm praying for us over this month is that we also put our yes on the table to God for him to expand our spheres of influence. To not just say, God, this is where you have me, I'm good here, but also to say, God, and I'm going to serve faithfully wherever I am, but also, God, I'm going to say to you, and wherever it is that you send me, I will go. My yes is on the table. And so those are the things I'm going to be praying for you as we go through Missions Month this morning. But let's get into the book of John. We are in chapter 18, and James, not the gospel writer, but John James, did a great job last week talking through the betrayal of Jesus. This takes place in the garden, his arrest, Judas's betrayal of Jesus, and then his trial, if you will, before the Jewish leaders, and we detailed Peter and his denial of Jesus. And now we're gonna be moving into the court of Roman law, right? So we're gonna be moving from the Jewish court of law, if you will, to now the Roman court of law. And I've got a little map here because I wanted to show you kind of where a lot of this takes place. Now the exact movements are pretty tricky to nail down exactly, but what I wanted you to just get in your mind was the relative proximity where all of this takes place. If you'll notice, the key is not on there. Okay, there's a key to this map that's not actually pictured, but basically if you'll notice, so the Garden of Gethsemane is outside and further away. The place of the high priest, that number 2 there, is where John walked through with us last week. And what we're going to do is we're going to move from number 2 to number 3. So we're going to the place of the high priest over to where Pilate is. That's maybe 1,500 feet in terms of the distance, right? So this is not very far. This is all happening, and I want you to have this in your imagination. This is happening very quickly. All of these things that we're reading, though John takes time to tell us the whole story, this is happening very, very quickly, and it's happening in a reasonably compact space. Even when you see number 6 is where this is going to end up, where Jesus is going to be crucified. Again, a relatively short space and distance to where everything is going on. So let's pick up in chapter 18, verse 28. It says, "Then they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the governor's headquarters. It was early morning. They themselves, speaking of the Jewish leaders, they themselves did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they would not be defiled, but could eat the Passover. So Pilate went outside to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered him, "If this man were not doing evil, we would not have delivered him over to you." That's a vague answer, isn't it? Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and judge him by your own law." The Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death." So you see there what they intend to do. Verse 32 tells us that this was to fulfill the word that Jesus had spoken to show by what kind of death he was going to die, alluding to what's coming, where Jesus is going to be crucified on a Roman cross. Now, John, the writer, the gospel writer of John, wants us to remember the time of year. He makes sure to remind us, and the reason for this, there's twofold reason that John reminds us that it is what time of year? Starts with a P. Can you say it? Passover. Now, why is this important? This is important, I think, in two major ways as it relates to our text this morning. Number one, it's important because during the Passover, a Jewish family would bring a lamb into their home. And they would bring that lamb into their home. Again, Passover is connected back to the story in the book of Exodus where God freed the children of Israel from Egyptian slavery. And so they would bring this lamb into their home, preparing for the sacrifice of Passover. But that preparation included the examination of this lamb to make sure that it was pure and spotless. That was what was required according to the law. And so in order to verify that this lamb was pure and spotless, there was a period of time where this family would welcome this lamb into their home, quite literally it becoming sort of like a pet for a period of time so that it could be examined to make sure it was an appropriate sacrifice for Passover. John wants us to remember this because what's happening to Jesus, the Lamb of God who's going to take away the sin of the world, Jesus is being examined. Jesus has been brought into the house of Israel and he is being examined. And the striking thing about this is that Jesus is going to be examined, and what we're going to find, though they will call for his death and call him guilty, what we'll actually find in this trial is that he is indeed a lamb without spot or blemish, that he is innocent, that he is perfectly righteous. And so that's one thing that John wants us to have in our minds, is the significance of Jesus as the Passover lamb. But the other reason that this is really important, you can see it here in verse 28, is because it really highlights the irony of the way in which Jesus is being led to this trial. Notice that it says that the Jewish leaders did not enter the governor's headquarters so that they, why, would not be defiled because it's Passover. And so the reason that they didn't go in is because during Passover, it was extraordinarily important for them to be clean as it relates to the law. So what would ritual purity look like? And in order to be ritually clean and pure, they cannot have contact with or be in the presence of the Gentile world, which was an unclean world. And so they're not going to associate with Pilate. They're not going to step into Pilate's headquarters because they need to keep themselves pure in order to celebrate the Passover. Do you see the irony here? And so by the letter of the law, they are keeping themselves pure, while at the same time, the irony is that they're avoiding their own defilement while accusing Jesus of evil. They are literally in this moment collaborating with the powers of the world while saying, but we're not really defiled. Do you see the irony? And this is really important irony for us to catch, because you can follow all the rules as it relates to the law. You can follow the rules as it relates to, quote, religion, while at the same time being corrupt and broken in the place of the heart. They are no more pure than Pilate. And yet they're going through ritual to make them feel okay while at the same time betraying the Son of God. And so they bring him to Pilate. Now let's talk a little bit about Pilate. Pilate would have been kind of a junior level politician. Okay, so he's kind of in the middle here somewhere, fighting for significance in the Roman world. And he's posted up here in this very interesting region in the Middle East. It's interesting now, it was interesting then. It's full of crazy chaos now, it was full of crazy chaos then. And his job, Pilate's job, as he was overseeing a Roman outpost, and his job was to keep the peace at all costs. Here's why. Because within this turbulent region, there was a flow of resources from Egypt to Rome. Now, a good pastor would have had the map for you, but I don't, so make your own assessment. But there was a flow of resources from Egypt to Rome. And actually, as I was reading on this, there's an estimate that about a third of the grain that Rome would use came from Egypt. So a significant supply of resources are moving from Egypt to Rome. And so Pilate's job in this region was to make sure that everything stayed okay, because this was critical for this flow of resources. And so he would have been this junior level politician trying to keep the peace in order to work up the ranks. And so what you're going to see here in this text is you're going to see this convergence of powers. You're going to see the convergence of powers in a way that is going to typify what John refers to as the sins of the world, okay? So here's what you have in this picture as it stands. You've got Rome, and you've got Pilate as a leader in that economy that is the world's greatest, maybe ever, the greatest, most powerful world power in human history. Rome at this time in the story, as it's unfolded in human history, is kind of the peak of Babylon, the peak of human power, of human rule. And then you've got the Jews. The Jews are, of course, God's chosen family. Now remember, the Jews have been rescued out from underneath the world's powers, and they've been marked out by God to bear his name in the nations. But what we've seen over and over again in their story, and we're seeing it here, is that they have abdicated that responsibility. Their leaders have rejected the rule of Yahweh. The people have rejected the rule of Yahweh. And instead of bearing God's name in the nations, they've turned their back on who God is and his purpose in their life. And we're seeing this really typified right here. So right here in the book of John, we have this climactic intersection of the failure of God's people and the wicked kingdoms of the world. And now, if you're seeing this, now these two entities are collaborating and have set themselves against the Messiah. Do you see that? It is critical that you notice the convergence of these two groups, because within these two groups, what you have is a summation of the sins of the world. It's a picture of the reality that all human beings have come together and have collaborated, have turned their back on God. We can all be grouped and categorized into those two spaces. Jew and Gentile have both rejected God and his rule, and here they are collaborating, set against the Messiah. Again, quite literally here, we have Jesus taking on the sins of the world. And so let the trial begin. Pilate begins to question Jesus. Now, understanding who Pilate is, you'll probably pick out what his motives are in his line of questioning. Pick this up in verse 33. It says, "So Pilate entered his headquarters again and called Jesus and said to him, 'Are you the king of the Jews?' Jesus answered, 'Do you say this of your own accord, or did others say it to you about me?' Pilate answered, 'Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you over to me. What have you done?' Why does Pilate want to know if Jesus is a king? Because that's the one thing that could really go wrong for him, is if right under his nose a king rose up and created a problem. And so he's really tuned in to this idea of Jesus being a king, and he wants to know, why is it that your people have betrayed you? It's a bit strange that they're working with me. I need to know what you're about, really more so for the purpose of self-preservation. We don't know how Pilate really got to all of his conclusions, but he really wants to know, what's in your mind, Jesus? I need to be able to determine kind of what level of threat I'm dealing with. Because again, his primary responsibility, it's like, we're handing you this fragile thing. The only thing that you're responsible for is don't break it. Don't screw this up, Pilate. Keep this peace. And so he's got to know, what level of threat is Jesus to the peace in the region that I'm supposed to maintain? And so Jesus responds to him. Now, Jesus is going to respond, and he's going to use the word or the phrase, the world. I know that you guys memorize every sermon that I preach, and you can reference it really quickly, but just in case you missed a week, just in case, remember, we talked about what the world means in John, and you have to have that in your mind as you read Jesus' response. So real quickly, the world is all of the cosmos, all of what is created is what is referred to and held in this word, the world. The world also includes the human beings that inhabit God's created order, right? So when Jesus speaks of the world and his love for the world, he's speaking of all of creation and specifically human beings that inhabit his created order. But also in the world and part of the world are those evil and dark forces that are set against God and his kingdom that we see pop up in Genesis chapter 3, that these human beings have collaborated with and have brought chaos into God's created order. You see this? All of those elements are held in the word world, and we've got to understand that as we read Jesus' response. So Pilate wants to know, what are you up to? Are you a king? And here's what Jesus says, verse 36, Jesus answered, my kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting that I might not be delivered over to the Jews. But my kingdom is not from the world. Then Pilate said to him, I love this question. So you are a king? You know, one of the things we don't necessarily get as we read is tone. I would just love to know, what did he sound like when he said that? So you are a king? It's like, I asked you a pretty direct question. This feels like an indirect response. You use the word kingdom. I just need to know if you think you're a king, right? Jesus answered, you say that I am a king. For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. Now, why does Jesus say, my kingdom is not of this world? Again, we've got to understand Pilate. We've got to understand the questions that he's asking. Pilate wants to know if Jesus is a very specific kind of king. Pilate wants to know if Jesus is the kind of king that is going after power, that is going after the overthrow of the current power in the region to be another iteration of what happens over and over and over and over and over again in human history, which is somebody's in power for a little bit, call it a king, call it a kingdom, and then someone rises up, takes that over, they become a king, they have a kingdom, and then that cycle repeats over and over and over and over again. And so Pilate wants to know if that's what Jesus is about, because this would not be the first time in the region that this very thing would have taken place. There have been those in history, there have been those in recent history that have tried to overthrow the powers that be, and there will be some that come, and guess what? That cycle is alive and well today. You don't have to look far. Just turn on the news channel, and what you're going to see is human beings fighting for kingdoms, fighting for power. That's the cycle of the world. And they rise and fall and have throughout the context of sinful human history. And Jesus is saying to him as directly as he can, I'm not playing that game. If you think I'm just one that has popped up in the middle of the rise and fall of kingdoms, you are totally missing it. Because he answers him very straightforward, I am a king, but not the kind of king that you are thinking about. Not the kind of kingdom that you are thinking about. And he says to Pilate as directly as he can, because if I were, don't you think that when I was arrested, I might have charged my followers, instead of standing down, I might have said, okay, it's time to fight, but rather I came to you peacefully. If I were just another power-hungry individual trying to stir things up for the overthrow of the world's powers, I would have risen up on the day of my arrest, but here I am. Here's what I know. Pilate is so confused. Because he says in verse 37, so you are a king. And listen to Jesus' response. Jesus says, you say that I'm a king. What he's saying here is, you're talking about a king on a human level of understanding kings and kingdoms. And so Jesus tells Pilate directly what he's doing, and he uses different language. Why does he use different language? Not because Jesus is not a king, and not because Jesus doesn't have a kingdom. He has both of those, but he says something different because what he's doing is he's transcending the categories by which Pilate understands kings and kingdoms, in order to talk about something way bigger than what's in Pilate's mind. And so Jesus says, for this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world, to bear witness to the truth. He says, everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice. What in the world is Jesus talking about when he says that he has come to reveal truth? And why would Jesus say that in a conversation that is about kings and kingdoms? Because again, Jesus isn't interested in this moment of arguing with Pilate about the merits of worldly kingdoms. He's not there to try to set the record straight and go, hey, I want to make sure you know I'm not a threat at all. This movement is really small. Don't worry about me. Jesus doesn't get into any of that. He's got Pilate thinking right here. And what Jesus does is he goes, I need you to think about something different. I need to peel back the curtain a little bit and transcend these human categories so that you know why I'm really here. And I am really here for this purpose I was born into the world. Jesus says to reveal the truth. Now, what in the world does that phrase mean, and why does he use it here? The best way I can describe for you and I to think about this word truth, because I think sometimes we get confused in our modern use of the word truth. We think truth means facts that are right. Jesus is not saying to him, I came to tell you true things that you can check in your encyclopedia and, verify. True is more like, anybody in construction in here? Anybody in construction? Anybody? Come on, you just don't want to raise your hand. Emily Singer just rose her hand. Emily works here. I don't know. She's not in construction. Anybody, seriously, anybody in construction? Okay, if you were to say about, if you're leveling ground, fine, you're just gonna make me do it on my own, all right? If you don't want to volunteer. If you were leveling ground and you were to say that the line is true, or any archers, I know because y'all been missing Sundays, it's bow season. I got you. If an arrow is true, What does it mean? If the line in a construction context is true, if an arrow is true, it doesn't mean that it's said something right. Arrows don't speak. The point is, the line in construction to be true means it's as it should be. It is right. An arrow that is true has found its mark. It is flown to where it is supposed to be. It was aimed at a certain point and has gone true to where it was going. What Jesus is saying to Pilate is that I came to reveal what is true. What is true that Jesus is revealing? What has been maybe hidden until this point? What does John tell us? What does all of the gospel writers tell us? What does Paul tell us? What does the book of Hebrews tell us? What is it that Jesus has revealed that is true? The nature and the purpose of God. Jesus has pulled back the curtain on the question, who is God and what is he up to? And he's pointed at himself and saying, I'm revealing the very glory of the one that created all of the world. I'm not interested in fighting over these petty human kingdoms that rise and fall. I am revealing the nature of who God is. I am him. You see, this is what Jesus is. This is what's true. The truest thing is the person of God, his nature, who he is, and what he has come to do. And Jesus says to Pilate, I've come to reveal truth. And Pilate is still confused. He says, what is truth? It's a powerful question, and John just leaves us with it. John just leaves us with Pilate's question, I think on purpose. I think John really wants for you and I to hear what Jesus says when he says, I have come to reveal what is true, and he wants us to interact with Pilate's question, what is true, and I think he wants us to ask that question for ourselves. And so, what is Jesus going to do? What is this revealing of truth going to look like? He's going to reveal the nature of God. He's going to demonstrate the power of God. And he's going to do so by giving his life for what? For the sins of the world. He's going to do so. He's going to reveal truth by laying down his life at the hands of the convergence of the world's power. He is going to give himself for the sins of the world. Pilate then, and this is jumping into chapter 19, Pilate attempts to send a bit of a message. I think he's still thoroughly confused. And so in his world, what do you do with somebody that might be trouble, but you're not really sure about them? You beat them within an inch of their life so that they know who's in charge. And so this is what Pilate does. The scripture says in verse 1 through 7 that Pilate then has Jesus flogged, mocked and humiliated, beaten severely. Because Pilate's not quite sure about Jesus. And so again, the only thing he knows to do is to demonstrate the power of the world. He thinks he's sending a message here. I don't know what you're about. I don't know what your motives are, but just so you know before you leave here, and I don't know what your people are going to do, but just so you know who's in charge, we're going to make you feel it on your way out. Pilate humiliates Jesus, and then he gives him back to the Jews and says, I don't know of any reason to go any further. Basically, I think he's got the message. And then in verse 7, again, I'm in chapter 19. In verse 7, it says, the Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has made himself the Son of God. Now, Jesus is, we know from the book of Matthew, is going to perfectly fulfill the law. And Jesus does so as the Son of God by laying down his life in perfect love. But when the Jews say that he needs to be put to death, this really kind of seems to unnerve Pilate again. It's like he thinks he's done with Jesus. He thinks the Jews are just going to take him back. And then they make this statement that he needs to die because he is the Son of God. And it's like it resets the process for Pilate. It's like it gets him again in this place of vulnerability. And so he goes back into Jesus for further questioning. He's again suspicious. He doesn't know what to do with him. In verse 8, it says, when Pilate heard this statement, look at this, he was even more afraid. You can tell he's operating from total fear. And so he entered his headquarters again, and he said to Jesus, where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, you will not speak to me? And then watch this. Do you not know that I have authority to release you and authority to crucify you? Okay. We've crossed the line. Pilate is severely mistaken about the way that authority works. We know this because Pilate thinks he's demonstrating his absolute authority by beating and shaming Jesus. And then he says to Jesus, basically, you need me because I have authority over you. And I have the power of your life in my hands. I can release you or I can have you crucified. Look at Jesus' response in verse 11. This is a foundational core doctrine for us as believers. We must understand what Jesus says here. Jesus says to Pilate, you would have no authority over me at all unless it had been given you from above. Therefore, he who delivered me over to you has the greater sin. Now notice, in this passage, there are three sources of authority. The first is the embodiment of worldly power that Pilate represents. He is authority as it relates to the world's powers. That pagan world that seeks rule and domination through humiliation and violence and shame. Everything that Pilate has just done, he embodies the, quote, authority of the world. But Jesus also says that there's another authority here, and it is the one that delivered him over to Pilate. So who is the other authority? It's the religious leaders. It's those that have been entrusted to God's people for the purpose of leading them and shepherding them into faithfulness to God. But what are they doing? They're attempting to grapple and manipulate the world's powers into friendly cooperation with their own agenda. Pay attention, church. You've got the world's powers that want to rule through violence, shame, and humiliation. And then you've got the, quote, religious group that wants to utilize and piggyback on the power of the world, cooperate with the world in order to set forward its own agenda. That's the second authority. And then Jesus says, actually, there is a greater authority than those two. There is an authority that transcends the world powers. There's an authority that transcends the religious leaders and their leadership. And it is that authority which, quote, comes from above. Here's where we need to grab onto. Who is Jesus obviously speaking of? Who is the one that is from above? He's speaking of the authority of the Father. The one who is, John told us, from the beginning. The eternal one. He is the third authority in this picture. And what Jesus says to Pilate is that the Father has allowed for there to be a temporary and limited authority to the rulers of the world. He says to Pilate, what you think is absolute authority over me has only been given to you, has only been allowed to you by the true authority, which is that of the Father. And he has allowed for this moment for you to have what looks like authority over me. But by the way, as we're going to see here, and this is again, please hold on to this. Jesus makes it clear, and what we will see is that even in this allowing of human powers to have authority, even when they reject God, when they reject his will, Jesus is saying, even in that, God is able to use it for his ultimate good and glory. Even as both authorities beat and crucified Jesus, the ultimate rejection of God, even in that, God is able to use it for the redemption of the whole world. There is no power that is greater than that of the Father. And every human power, whether political and social or religious, every single one has their authority as a result of it being allowed by God. And none of them, even in their greatest rejection of God and his will, are able to thwart the good purposes of God for the advance of his kingdom. And so I would say to you, believers living in a context where the powers of the world are alive and well and doing the kingdom fight thing, I would say to you, fear not. There is no authority of man that can steer and direct the purposes of God in human history. And by the way, here's what Jesus says. By the way, those powers will be held to account for the way in which they use that authority. He says of those who turned Jesus over to them, he calls it sin. And they will be held to account for sin. All power and authority will be held to account for whether that authority was used in a way that glorifies God or not. They will be held to account and judgment in the end. And that's what Paul talks about in Romans chapter 13. Okay, I've got to finish this sermon. And we got 5 verses left. Okay, here we go. Ready? From then on, verse 12, Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are not Caesar's friend. Notice what they're trying to do to coerce Pilate into doing what they want. So when Pilate heard these words, it worked. He brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat in a place called the Stone Pavement in Aramaic, Gabbatha. And now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, behold your king. And they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, and again, let the irony of this sink in. Pilate says, shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, and this is kind of curtains on the whole establishment. They answer, we have no king but Caesar. I don't know how to make the parallel, and I'm not trying to be controversial here, but like if you walked into a church and they were singing praise to Trump, how disturbed would that be? If you heard a church like in their benediction say something like, we have no king but Trump. Like, it sounds so weird to say out loud, right? But that's what you're hearing. I mean, it should disturb you on that level. Just think about that, church. We have no king. And this just ties in, this statement ties in the entire story of the Old Testament leading to this point where God's people would ultimately say to God, you are not our king. We belong to the world's power. And just in case you and I think that we're exempt from that, I want you to know we have all chanted that very phrase. We have all done so. Every single one of us in this room is guilty of the very same thing by saying we have no king but what is human. It may have a different name than Caesar today, but the point is that every single one of us, and that's the whole point of both of these converging together, the religious leaders and the leaders of the day, this is the convergence of all of humanity saying to God, we do not belong to you. This is the full rejection of who God is. And the thing that is just so powerful here that you've got to grab is that it is right after these words that Jesus goes and lays down his life for them. Can you just for a minute let the weight of that sink into your heart? That the loudest cry of the rejection of God's people is followed by the greatest act of love that the world has ever seen. Jesus, on the tail end of Caesar's name coming off of their lips, Jesus extends himself on a cross to die for it. He wasn't dying for somebody else. He was dying for the very ones that betrayed him. In the world represented by Caesar and in God's family, the Jews, he was dying for all of it, you and me. And he did so on the tail end of our loudest betrayal and rejection of him. This is what Paul has in mind when he says that Christ died for us while we were yet sinners. Man, I hope the weight of that sinks into your heart this morning. Because what does Jesus do? Okay, I really am almost through. I'm getting excited. That's what happens when I go to a pastor thing. I get excited. And what does Jesus do? In the midst of all of this, what does Jesus do? Read these words, verse 16. So he delivered, this is speaking of Pilate, he delivered him over to them to be crucified. So they took Jesus and went out. And Jesus goes out, look at these words, bearing his own cross. So quietly, confidently, and courageously, in submission to the will of the Father, Jesus carries the cross, which in that moment is that symbol of absolute authority in the world. But it's about to be totally transformed. It's about to be totally flipped on its head. And instead of it being a symbol for the authority of the world, it's about to be a picture of the massive grace and love of God for the world. Amen? Amen. I've preached longer than I should. So let's go into our time of invitation. And I want to just ask you this question as we do so. Where do we find ourselves in the midst of this raging of nations, this raging of powers? Because there are rulers and authorities in the world today like Pilate that are seeking their own agendas for power and control through whatever means necessary. That's still going on. And there are those who claim a religious or even Christian agenda that are trying to use the world's powers to figure out how they get ahead and then for their own self-preservation and glory. The point is, the same scene from John 19 is still happening today. But then there's Jesus. There's Jesus going this third way, not going the way of the world. There's Jesus in the midst of this scene of the raging of nations. Jesus quietly picks up his cross and carries it to lay down his life for the sin of the world. What a powerful picture of what the Christian life could be, should be. We live in the midst of the raging of nations. people trying to get ahead by whatever means necessary, people fighting for authority on human terms and doing whatever they've got to do it. And then there should be Christians quietly going the way of Jesus, quietly laying down their lives, quietly picking up the cross, not attempting to get this authority or this position or whatever, but just slowly but surely, step by step, every day, carrying the weight and the burden of the cross, laying down their life as their Savior laid down his for others to know him. So I would ask you to reflect on, where are you? Are we going the way of religious leaders? Are we going the way of the world? Are we going the way of Jesus? Picking up our cross daily. In the back of the room, we're going to have prayer partners, and they're just there if you would like to pray with somebody on whatever it may be. If you want to pray with somebody, we would be happy to pray with you. But I would like for you to stand, and we're going to worship as we close this morning.